Welcome, welcome. Welcome to the first edition, the first episode of this ongoing series. So a friend of mine, and Russell, I'm looking at you, asked me to write what he called a layperson's guide to philosophy. Cut out all the jargon, cut out the incomprehensible academic vocabulary and jargon, etc., and try to make something direct, something that is easily understandable. I've been wanting to do this for a while. In fact, good friend Joel Southall and I are coming up with our own version of this, and that podcast will be out sometime soon. At any rate, I thought I would do an audio version because I'm writing obsessively all the time anyway for my PhD. So, there you go. And I am very much invested myself in, we'll get into in a minute what we even mean by philosophy, but I am very dedicated to it as a way of life, as a way to inspire us with some kind of wisdom, some kind of therapeutic way of walking through life, of understanding this often contradictory, incomprehensible existence we find ourselves in. So with that word philosophy, and of course we could write a 1,000-page book debating what that is, but we won't. It literally means, if you trace it to the Greek roots, philosophia, the love of wisdom. And of course we have to ask, what system, what tradition are we even talking about? So that specific word is directly tied to what we understand as the Western tradition, specifically what comes out of the ancient Greeks. I will be doing more cross-cultural comparisons, bring in perspectives from some indigenous American worldviews, which is directly connected to my ancestry. I am also right now working on a PhD in Indian philosophy and religious studies that I do field work for, ethnography. So I will be drawing in some influences there and just, kind of a cross-section of different cultural perspectives on what is philosophical. So, the love of wisdom is where we start from. So, of course, wisdom, that's a pretty huge one. I think many of us have an understanding or our own hunch of what that means. It's certainly different from information, it's different from knowledge, and perhaps we can unpack what that means as the series goes on. Again, my understanding is that wisdom should guide us. It should enliven us, so to speak. It should inspire our way through this mystery of life. And so the one who loves wisdom is a philosopher, and that's anybody. That's anybody. Any of us with sufficient curiosity, sufficient wonder, in terms of wondering about, having both wondering or speculating and also having a sense of wonder or a sense of awe, a sense of excitement is very central to this whole project. And I just want to say to John Losey, if you're listening to this, you like to joke multiple times when I was an undergraduate that philosophy is thinking deep thoughts about not having a job. And yes, I've lived unemployed now and then, but I have to tell you, John, I am employed. So there you go. We philosophers can still, God forbid, hold down a job. Okay. So I'm going to do a chronological approach. I might mix it with thematic. But for now, I am going to start at the beginning, with the Pre-Socratics, literally before Socrates. And Socrates, or Socrates in Greek, is such a huge figure in the tradition, almost everyone knows that name, that essentially the people before Socrates was around just gets lumped into this category of the Pre-Socratics. So it's just a way of delineating or separating in terms of time different eras of different thinkers. Thales, we will begin with. Thales is quite an interesting, well, a lot of these people think are interesting thinkers. But Thales is influential, certainly. He is most well known for his cosmology, or his understanding of how the universe is composed. He is deeply influenced by the four-element theory of the universe. This is probably common to many of us: earth, wind, fire, water. Of course, there's also a five-element system. And throughout India, throughout South Asia, that is also a strong theory. It's a very influential theory that you have these four fundamental components of the universe, that everything can be reduced to these. And then you have the five-elemental theory, the fifth one being Akasha, or something like space, or the ether, or expansiveness, the sky. Now, Aristotle the Great, we know, went to India as part of his conquest. He interacted with people, including Brahmins, including the philosophers. There might be some back and forth here with the importance of the four-element / five-element theory between Greece, Middle East, Persia perhaps, and India. There certainly is some evidence that could support that. At any rate, it is very central for Thales' theory. Now, I will bring this up a few times, but you really need to do a thought exercise. You need to do a little make-believe, or project yourself. Here we're around 500 BCE, maybe a little bit before, well over 2,000 years ago. And so the people attempting to understand the universe are working with a very, very different set of cards, so to speak, in terms of technology, in terms of theory, in terms of what we call science. Now, again, science is related, the Latin root is to know, so it's a form of knowledge. Therefore, science can encompass many things. Knowing encompasses many things. And these Pre-Socratics were very influential in what would go on to become our modern scientific understanding, which is now sweeping the world in terms of how it translates to, engineering, technological advancement, things of this sort. And so Thales is attempting, via just pure observation, so we call this empirical observation, with the senses, observing very closely the phenomena of life, what comes and goes, what transforms from one state to another. He's very interested in the arche, or we might translate this as the nature or principle, perhaps, the underlying causality, the underlying factors or existence that causes all things, that is the animator, so to speak. And he believed that what we understand as matter, as nature, as the earth, as everything surrounding us, is alive or has a divine energy or motion to us. This is mostly through secondhand accounts of Aristotle's analysis, who comes a bit later down the road. And you'll find that very common as well, especially with the Pre-Socratics, who either didn't leave writings behind or just left some quotes behind, or the texts were lost. So it has to be picked up by philosophers later on, who then go back and analyze. You see this in religion all the time with the prophets and the great figures throughout many traditions. So at any rate, he didn't particularly delve too much into the deity, and he's very this worldly. He's not necessarily even conceiving of a transcendental deity or God beyond our visible apparent universe. He doesn't talk about that at all. He might have thought that, but he's very much grounded in our everyday experiences and what comes to us via our senses. And guess what? That's the primary reality for all of us, as far as I know. What our primary five senses take in and then process through our complex set of emotions and thought and consciousness. We'll be delving into what that could possibly mean later on. And given his careful observation, again, he thinks that there's this enlivened quality, or everything is a spark of divinity. The underlying substance of it all is water. It's interesting. Water is the supportive substratum, the underlying existent. Now think about that. Why would he conclude this? On one level, it makes a lot of sense. Think how dependent we all are on water to drink. Much of this earth is water. We know this. He was living somewhere in Asia Minor, or what is now Turkey, so he's near the Mediterranean Sea, as are many of these thinkers near the Mediterranean Sea. So you're surrounded by the ocean. The sea is very much, your whole life is very much bound up in observing what goes on in this coastal area. That's very central and important. If he had gone and seen autopsies or seen people work on dead bodies, then perhaps he would have noticed how much water is there, how much fluid is inside the body. Again, we are composed primarily of water. This is known at this point. And in the decomposition of matter, things often liquefy, they often return to a watery state. Think about the hydrologic cycle, the movement of rain, which then gets absorbed into soil, it's evaporated, enters clouds, the cycle begins all over again, forever, on and on and on and on and on. So water is obviously very central to our experience, to our health, to our bodies, and it does make a lot of sense that someone paying close attention might think, maybe water is the ultimate substance, the underlying principle of all things. And part of, I'm not sure if mystical is quite the right word, but there's certainly a sense of the sacred in terms of just the natural world around us, what we call matter, the sky and the sea and the rivers and the lakes, the grasses, the trees, all the biological beings, human or non-human animals, whatever is part of this earth does have this living quality of some kind of divine being. And it's not, this is quite crucial, it's not to be found anywhere else. It's not to be found outside this life, beyond this life, after this life. It's very much here and now, and it's surrounding us at all times. This sanctity. It is within or inherent in matter. He's also known for a few mathematical theorems. These people tended to do it all, which makes sense. Again, they're attempting to make sense of our reality. So everything would be covered. What we understand now is scientific inquiry, mathematics, astronomy, what might be understood as psychology, as a way to live well, what is later called the good life, or eudaimonia with Aristotle, flourishing, how to live in well-being, how to live a flourishing life. All of these subjects are important. So water is the constituted principle of all things. And then he even gives arguments about how the other elements ultimately dissolve back into water. It doesn't matter if it's earth or fire or air. It is all dependent on the single substance, the single substratum. He might have been influenced by Babylonian or Chaldean concepts, theological concepts. You know, that's even perhaps in Genesis of the waters, the primordial waters that were there before creation, before existence. And you have different thinkers down the road, some Romans such as Virgil, who take up similar beliefs about this ultimate nature being water. All right. So again, these early thinkers form the foundation for what later gets much more systematized, categorized into a more coherent system of what is now called philosophy. You might wonder, well, how is this any different from the many religions of the world? And the reason it's deeply interwoven with the religious traditions, particularly since we're talking about largely the Greco-Roman historical tradition, and they interact deeply with Judaism, with Christianity, with Islam. But what is different is this is the foundation. The founding premise is not anything to do with theology or with religion or sacred text or the Bible. That is theology. This is starting from scratch, so to speak. It's starting with the powers of human cognition or thought, human observation, our inner life, and then, based on logic and reasoning, refining further and further and further those postulates or those premises. And we have those who attempt to validate this with mathematics, for instance, to explain the workings of the universe. So they're trying to weave together multiple threads into some cohesive understanding of this ever-perplexing universe, which we still know extremely minute amount about, which is, I think, what's quite amazing about being alive at all in this mysterious cosmos. So that is the real difference, is going a separate trajectory from what religion covers. Though all the same topics will more or less be touched, and every stone is definitely turned over here. It is still starting with a radically different premise, and in many ways becomes very humanist, or becomes very centered on what is our human ability to understand, to make sense of this ongoing flux surrounding us.